Kimberly Wilson.
Hello, how are you doing?
I am very good. Thank you so much for being part of the Happy Place Virtual Festival. It's really lovely to have you along. I recently read your book, How to Build a Healthy Brain, which, my God, it's such a thorough book. I would describe it as a kind of through the keyhole of the brain, because I really got to know like what is going on in there. And yeah, I gained a lot. And I think one of your overall messages in the book is for us to all seek to remember that there is a connection between our physical body and our mind, which sounds really obvious, but I do think we forget that a lot.
We completely forget that. And when I say we, it's not just the public, it's psychology and psychiatry have a real history of doing this as well. You know, when I went through my training, in my undergrad, we do a little bit of kind of neuroanatomy and understanding areas of the brain, but nothing on actually protecting the brain, looking after brain health, knowing, you know, what nutrients, for example, might be important in relation to things like depression, which is kind of the bread and butter of psychology. And the reason for that is because nobody was really thinking about it properly at the time. And so this is much more recent kind of a synergy, but a kind of reconnection between actually the brain is a physical organ that is fed and protected by what's happening in the body. And therefore, if we're going to look after the brain and by extension mental health, we need to be thinking about what's going on in the body as well.
Yeah, and you cover so many different subjects that allow us to ponder that thought, whether it be looking at relationships in our lives, looking at, you know, your job, how you earn money, habitual patterns that you get into, and of course, diet. And as a psychologist and a nutritionist, that seems to be something that you're really focused on getting out there, because there can be fundamental change if we look at our diet and what we're consuming as to how our brains operate.
Yeah, and again, like, it does seem obvious, but when I say it, people kind of take a moment, but your brain, like the rest of you, is made of food, and your brain in particular is made of particular nutrients that you can only get from food. And so if you're not eating those foods, very, very simply, you are deficient and your brain can't work as optimally as you would like it to. And this has really, really big implications, not only just when we're talking about mental health and well-being and helping people to recover, because that's what we want. When people come to me for depression, I want to help them recover as quickly and as completely as possible, but also for child development and child behavior, you know, because the brain goes through this huge period of rapid growth and development in pregnancy and also early years. And that's when it's absolutely crucial that children are getting the right nutrients. And we know that children who don't have those nutrients have impaired brain development, impaired behavior, impaired management of their aggression and their feelings. And that can drive long-term, you know, mental health concerns. And so actually it's kind of a social justice issue. It's certainly a social care issue, making sure that children have enough of the right foods for healthy brain development.
I know. I mean, it's something that I've thought about a lot since, you know, we had a phone call this week, and I've thought a lot about what we talked about on the phone, because, you know, for families that have a low income and for families that are struggling, to get that food on the table can be near impossible. So, you know, this is a problem that we all need to solve together. And at the moment, it does fall at the hands of charities and initiatives that are set up to help children in that way, because they should all have a fair chance of getting to school and having the brain space to ingest what's being delivered. So it's a huge problem. It's a really huge problem. And also something else I was thinking about when I was reading the book to do with diet and nutrition. For you, I mean, you've got such a job on your hands with each bespoke person that comes to you with their own set of challenges and sort of focal points that they want to work on. And with food, especially when there's eating disorders afoot, which you write about very articulately in the book, because, you know, usually people that are dealing with disordered behavior around food, there are mental implications, but also perhaps mental disorders that come along with them. So how you tackle that, I don't know. That's a very tricky. And I've had a lot of eating disorders growing up as well, and I'm not sure which came first and which affected which bit of it. But that's complex.
It really is. And it really makes the point that, because one of the things that I find quite concerning, and when I'm working with eating disorders, I'm often working with a dietitian as well. It's often a kind of group or team job. But one of the things that's really, really concerning is that there are, I think, lots of people in need who are going to just nutritional professionals to deal with their eating disorders. And we need to remember that eating disorders are mental health conditions, they're psychiatric disorders. And so if you're not having the psychological support alongside it, it's not just about the food. It's never just about the food. And so you're missing a big piece of the puzzle if you're only seeing a nutritional professional. You need to see a nutrition professional as well, but it's not going to touch the size, because we're talking about how people use food to manage emotion quite often, or manage self-esteem, manage difficulty, manage anxiety. And so you need to be addressing those things at the same time. So the way I try to deal with it is to be as comprehensive as possible. So when people come to see me, I'm getting a food diary, I'm getting a sleep diary, I'm getting a full medical history. I want to know how many courses of antibiotics you've been on in your life. I want to know your relationship with food, to get, as well as doing a psychological assessment, which usually takes 2 or 3 sessions. So I get as comprehensive an idea of your overall functioning, not just how many calories you're eating a day or what your mood is like, but those things put together, so that we can try to identify as many and effective ways of intervening as possible.
Wow, I mean, that's why your book, I've had so many takeaway moments, because I think the more that you educate yourself on the background of what's going on, rather than just your own reactions to what's going on in life, whether that be through eating, your relationships, any other habitual patterns that are happening, I think to look at the sort of undercurrent of what's going on is so helpful. That sort of getting right back to basics and looking at the science of it's been fascinating for me to read. We've obviously had a very intense year so far. 2020 has been, there are no words to really describe what globally everybody has been feeling and processing. Not only are we living through this global pandemic, which has had a lot of restrictions and caused a lot of problems for a lot of people, we're now also in this much needed discussion about race. And all of us have been thinking of very little else. I think it's been a time of deep reflection and a time of listening. And for me, looking at your Instagram has been truly thought-provoking and helpful. And one thing I'd love to talk more about, which was one of your recent posts, was discussing courage over convenience. And I hadn't really heard of that phrase before in this context. And I think it's deeply important. And I would love you to expand on that, if you would.
Sure. So it was really, I tend to kind of think ahead a lot. That's my job, is to kind of identify the stumbling blocks to change and what people might need to do so that we can prepare. So I can prepare people for how they will mitigate problems coming forward. And so I'm sitting here with some really strong feelings of my own around this kind of new wave of interest and awareness and understanding around race inequality, both here and in the US. And partly feeling quite hopeful, because this level of interest from non-Black people feels unprecedented. But also aware that though we have this initial motivation to change is really difficult, actually, even on an individual level. If you're ever trying to change a behavior, whether it's quitting smoking or, some aspect of your life, change is really difficult. And change that is on a organizational, social, cultural, systemic level is going to be even more difficult. And what it's always going to require, because it's always easier to fall back on the status quo. It's always easier to just go back to how things were. It was easier, I have to step out of my comfort zone. And so in order to step out of that comfort zone, we really have to connect with our own courage. We always have to be coming back to, actually, I'm going to commit to doing the difficult thing. And I'm going to commit to doing the difficult thing because it's the right thing, even if it's not the easy thing. And I think that is a commitment to be morally or personally courageous over the convenience of letting things fall back to the status quo. So it was really about trying to just highlight for people, flag that in their minds, like this is going to be difficult. And particularly if this doesn't feel like your struggle, if it's not your daily life, if you're not the one going out and facing racist abuse, it's going to take courage and generosity and empathy to stand up for someone when it might put you at a disadvantage or it might make life uncomfortable for you. So it was, kind of trying to flag that for people.
It was a wonderful video. And thinking on that, is it a very important combination of those aspects you just talked about, whether it be compassion, empathy, having a greater understanding, but also as a psychologist on a cognitive level about repetition? All change requires practice and habit. And I wonder if that comes into play with this.
No, absolutely. One of the things that gets in the way when people are trying to change is that when you have those, predictable, inevitable stumbling blocks, those relapses, those falls back, people think, oh, well, I haven't changed, that I've had one stumble, it means it's all over, as if change is supposed to happen like that, because as if it's supposed to be an absolute. That's not the way psychologically we conceive of change. We see change as a cycle that goes round and round. And one of those steps on that cycle is relapse. You're going to mess up. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to make a mistake. You're going to ignore something. You're going to fall back to the way it was. What's important is that you recognize that, you realize that, and then you try again. And it's in those repetitions that those new behaviors and psychologically, neurologically, those new neural pathways get embedded and get reinforced. And then over time, with repetition, that becomes the new way of being, the new behavior, the new normal.
And like you say, paves way for hopeful change. And I think a lot of people are feeling hopeful amongst the pain and suffering that's going on. And it just requires en masse commitment at the moment. You've also taught socially on Instagram, and I know you've written about this, about racial weathering. Could you explain that a little more to us?
Sure. So racial weathering is a theory of why it is that, and it comes out of US research, why it is that Black physical health seems to erode much more quickly than white physical health. And the researcher who noticed this, she was running programs for pregnant teenagers. And she noticed that even at these young ages, 15, 16, 17, that the Black girls were coming in with many more markers of physical health concerns. So more likely to have diabetes, more likely to have higher levels of stress, more likely to have mental health concerns. And whilst this is a complex issue and lots of things can affect that, one of the things that she came back to was this idea of the repeated exposure to stress as one of the driving factors for this erosion in health. And we know that, kind of mechanistically, we know that happens. We know, for example, that children who grow up in stressful or, harmful environments have higher resting levels of stress hormones, and that it's these higher resting levels of stress hormones that can end up over time being corrosive to the brain, being dangerous for the brain, as well as other aspects of health. And we see it in older ages too. We know that if we take a group of people and we say, how stressed are you? Low, medium, high. Those people who say medium and high 10 years later are much more likely to have signs of Alzheimer's disease. So we know that stress is corrosive to health across the board. And so the racial weathering hypothesis is that if you are someone who has to go outside and face racial abuse, face being considered second class, face, the anxiety of being pulled over by a police officer and being unsure about how that interaction is going to go, having to face going into bank and asking for a loan and being refused, all of these little moments of discrimination trigger a stress response, and that contributes to these health inequalities that this researcher was seeing.
And also it goes back to our initial point about how mental stress manifests physically, and that being, a huge, huge problem globally. Another thing I'd love to talk to you about is something that I've thought about a lot since I started this whole new sort of happy place thing, all accidentally, but I kind of found myself a lot of the time plopped into the well-being world, which I don't always know is sort of accurate as to what, I feel we're doing, but I get plopped in that world and, that's fine. But I've been able to have a more expansive look at what the well-being world looks like from lots of different angles, from either when I've been a contributor, a collaborator, an observer. And the wellness industry is alarmingly white. And it has certainly irked me somewhat over the years. And I know that you've talked about this as well, and your own personal experience, with the work that you do in the wellbeing sector as well. Could you talk to us about that?
Sure. And a friend of mine, I did her podcast 2 years ago, and she just reminded me that in this podcast, we were talking about this, the kind of overwhelming whiteness of wellness. And I have certainly, in my Instagram stories, when I've been invited to panels for various kind of big brand wellness events, and I've looked around, and it's just been a kind of sea of, and even within the group, it's kind of a very particular type of woman. It's a kind of young, blonde woman in, sweatpants. And what's really striking about this is that if wellness is about health promotion and reducing the risk of lifestyle-related illnesses, which is the claim, it's all about, helping people understand how to stay well, then actually what we know is that the people who are at most risk of lifestyle-related illnesses, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, hypertension, are people from Black, Asian, and ethnic minorities. And so if this is really the remit of wellness, why is it not reaching the people to whom it could have the most benefit, right? And everyone's, entitled to health information, but the people who will benefit from it most are just not present. And I think that's the question. What do we stand for? If we're talking about wellness being about health promotion, why are we not promoting it to the people who are more likely to have health concerns?
I know, it's something I kind of can't stop thinking about at the moment. And huge change needs to happen in many areas, but that one big time. Something a lot of people are feeling right now, again, for many reasons, whether that be what's been happening with the global pandemic, how people have reacted to discussing race on this level, especially if it has, been a very painful experience for them to open up, talk publicly or to their friends and family about that subject matter. Mm-hmm. The one thing that's on the rise we know is anxiety. Lots of people feeling heightened anxiety, a low-level hum of anxiety they can't quite put their finger on. As a psychologist, what would you say to people in that situation at the moment? Because I think it's probably one of the sort of the most heightened times of anxiety, and we've seen it incrementally increase over the years anyway, but this year it seems to be at an all-time peak. What's your guidance on that one?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the first thing to say is that we need to understand that a lot of this anxiety is natural, normal, and necessary, right?
Yes.
Because Anxiety is your signal of threat. And certainly for the last 5-6 months, we've been told there is a very dangerous threat out there in the world. And you need to take all of these precautions to stay safe and away from it. So in that sense, this general rise in anxiety is very, very normal. So, I'm very, very careful, and I'd like more people to be careful about pathologizing normal reactions to things.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling more anxious, I don't want you to think, oh no, I've got an anxiety disorder. Actually, you're probably responding with a normal level of anxiety to an increased level of threat. Is kind of one thing. But I think there is a greater level of anxiety in our society and in our generation and the generation below. And we know that anxiety is, as I say, is associated with a sense of threat, but also with a sense of a lack of safety or instability. And we see that in our society, with 0 hours contracts where people don't know how many hours of work they're going to have, which means they don't know whether they're going to be able to cover their bills and cover their rent, with rent rises that are so high people can barely afford to live month to month. They don't, and people don't think I'll ever be able to have a comfortable life, maybe buy a house, because I'll never be able to save enough for a deposit. What does that mean about being able to save for even later, for retirement, for later in life? People don't have the time to invest in their health. So actually we have a society that is fundamentally insecure. And again, in that sense, this level of anxiety is kind of normal. And so the second part of not pathologizing normal responses is saying, actually, maybe it's not the individual's fault for, or their responsibility. So I wouldn't be saying, Fearne, if you're feeling anxious, you just need to kind of sort it out.
Yeah. Actually,
there's a societal level where we need to try to make society a more equitable, safer, more secure state for everybody, is a second thing. And then after that, so in terms of what individuals can do is, first really trying to understand where their anxiety is coming from. Where do you experience it in your body? Is it in your head? Is it in your hands? Is it in your heartbeat? How much time do you take to stop and rest? Because that's the other thing, is that we're kind of on this perpetual loop of productivity and doing and ticking boxes, trying to, get ahead. And you'll just drive your own adrenaline through the roof, which is going to trigger anxiety responses. So it's probably worth taking a bit of an audit of your life. What time am I waking up? Is that a natural time, or am I waking up extra early because I feel like I need to cram other things into my life? What am I doing day to day? What interactions am I having? Are my relationships safe? Do they make me feel secure? Or do I have, frenemies, relationships with people kind of anxious and insecure and who I feel like I need to impress? All of this stuff to think about. And then, often, working with a professional can help you identify those things, and seeing whether it's about changing aspects of your life, giving you tools, breathing exercises, movement exercises that will help you manage that physiological stress, or just helping you to understand your reaction to your anxiety. So anxiety is a big issue, and there's lots of ways to understand it. And I think we're looking at different levels.
Well, I think that, you cover all of those aspects in the book. And again, the sort of fundamental understanding being, usually the things that are going to help are going to be free. And they are, like you say, breathing exercises, moving your body, diet, looking at relationships. And it is stuff but you do need the headspace and clarity and ability to sort of step back to do so. And also I really am so on board with what you started with there about not then loading yourself with sort of shame and guilt that you feel anxious about what's going on now. Because what's the point in adding more negative emotion to something that you're already struggling with? And, I think we are all trying to process so much at the moment and digest so much. And also we're all a little on edge as to what happens next and, and how we react to that, because the future is uncertain in so many ways at the moment. And, we don't need to kind of lumber ourselves with more negative emotion. We just need to go, I just feel a bit anxious at the moment. And most other people do. And I wonder if actually a brilliant thing to do, I certainly find it helpful, is just to talk to someone like your friend. And maybe they haven't admitted to you that they're also feeling anxious. But if you don't speak to them, they don't know, you don't know. And I guess, like you said in the book as well, conversation is is a huge part of understanding yourself as well as other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly around the ideas of guilt and shame, because I'm seeing lots of people talk about how guilty they feel and how ashamed they feel. And it's important to make a distinction between those two emotions, right? Because actually guilt, healthy guilt, is an important emotion, because what it tells us is that, you know, I feel like I've hurt someone, and guilt tends to push us to repair. It's a kind of reparation emotion to make that better. If I've upset you, I feel guilty, and so I want to try and make that better. Shame is kind of the opposite. Shame says, I am wrong, and actually it tends to lead people to retreat and withdraw and remove themselves from the situation or from the environment or from that relationship. And what we don't need right now is people retreating and withdrawing because they feel ashamed. So, you know, a little bit of self-compassion. It's a weird place that we're in. You know, it's a global pandemic, and then this kind of racial awakening across the world. No one could have predicted it, and it will take a little bit of adjustment. Shame isn't going to help. Actually, what's going to help is, you know, feeling the feeling, being in the emotion, taking a moment, and then deciding, what can I do? Who can I speak to? What can I learn? And how can I contribute to making this better for everyone? Because that's the point, that it's about making things equal, because we all do better when we all do better. You know, it's a shared endeavor in that sense.
But I love the sort of equation there of digging yourself out of that place of shame, which we've all felt at some point in our lives over something. The way to dig yourself out of that is with self-compassion. And that's empowering to know that you have the propensity to do that. With self-compassion, I guess you move one level up from shame to guilt to then make positive action. And that's a really empowering and important notion to think about. I think it can be probably quite liberating. And again, like you said, there's no room for shame right now. There's no time for shame right now. It's time for change and newness, and new habits and new neural pathways and all of that stuff that's going to get us to good positive change. Kimberly, I'm so grateful for your time and for you stopping by the Happy Place Virtual Festival. It's been an absolute joy to talk to you, and I really hope we get to do this again soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.